It was a brisk autumn evening in the city of Ravensborough, where the streets buzzed with activity as locals scurried to wrap up their day. Cobblestones shimmered under the faint glow of streetlights, rain from earlier leaving a slick sheen on the pavement. Among the bustling crowd, Sophia Grant, a 32-year-old neurosurgeon with sharp features and a poised demeanor, stepped out of a well-loved cafe at the corner of Elm and Birch. Clad in a tailored beige coat and ankle boots, she carried a leather satchel over her shoulder, her face calm but focused. Inside her bag was a medical report she needed to review for an urgent surgery scheduled that night. Sophia's days were relentless, and this was one of the rare moments she allowed herself to indulge in a quick latte. As she approached her car parked along the curb, the city's usual hum of life was abruptly disrupted by the sharp wail of a police siren. A black and white patrol car screeched to a halt a few feet away, its red and blue lights flashing vividly against the darkening sky. Two officers stepped out. The first, Officer Derek Lane, was tall and broad-shouldered, his face set in a stern expression. His partner, Officer Mike Reed, shorter but equally intimidating, wore a smirk that seemed to mock the authority he wielded. Both were dressed in full uniform, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. Sophia paused, puzzled by the sudden commotion. She glanced around, wondering who the officers were targeting, until she realized they were heading straight toward her. Her heart skipped a beat as she adjusted the strap of her satchel, her mind racing to understand what she could have done to attract their attention. "Ma'am, we need to have a word with you," Officer Lane said as they approached, his voice firm but devoid of warmth. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, as if sizing her up. "Is there a problem, officers?" Sophia asked, keeping her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. Officer Reed chuckled softly, his smirk widening. "We received a report about suspicious activity in this area. You fit the description." Sophia's brows furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I've just come from the cafe," she said, gesturing to the warmly lit establishment behind her. "I'm not sure how I fit any description." Lane's expression hardened. "That's not for you to decide, ma'am. We'll need to verify your identity and conduct a search." Sophia's pulse quickened. The words felt like a slap. "A search?" she repeated incredulously. "On what grounds?" Reed took a step closer, his smirk replaced by a steely glare. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" he asked, his tone dripping with menace. Around them, pedestrians began to slow their pace, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. A few exchanged concerned glances, while others quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. The tension in the air was palpable. Sophia's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. "Officers, I respect the work you do, but this feels unwarranted," she said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "If there's no specific reason for this, I'd like to go on my way." Lane's jaw clenched. "This isn't optional. Put your bag down and step aside." Sophia hesitated. Her instincts told her to comply, but a deep sense of indignation welled up inside her. She had done nothing wrong, and the way they were treating her felt deeply unjust. "I'm a doctor," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm on my way to the hospital. There are lives depending on me." Reed's chuckle returned, cold and condescending. "A doctor, huh? That's a new one. Do you have proof of that, ma'am?" Before Sophia could respond, Lane reached for her bag. Reflexively, she stepped back, holding it tighter. "You can't just take my things without cause," she said sharply. "That's resisting," Lane snapped, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sophia froze, her mind racing. She glanced around, hoping for someone to intervene, but the bystanders remained rooted in place, their faces etched with unease. "This is a mistake," Sophia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong." Lane ignored her, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Reed moved to block her path, his hand resting on his belt where his baton hung ominously. "Last chance," Lane said. "Comply or we'll escalate." Sophia's breath hitched. She was acutely aware of the growing crowd, the cold metal cuffs, the flashing lights. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was humiliation. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" The officers turned to see an older man stepping forward from the crowd. His salt-and-pepper hair and commanding presence made him impossible to ignore. He wore a neatly pressed suit and carried himself with an air of authority. "This is a police matter, sir. Please step back, Lane said curtly. The man didn't budge. And I'm the chief of surgery at Ravensborough General, he said. Dr. Richard Hayes. This woman is one of my surgeons, and if you're detaining her, I have every right to know why. The crowd murmured, emboldened by the man's presence. Sophia felt a surge of relief, but also a pang of worry. Would this escalate further? Lane's confidence faltered, but Reed stepped in. Sir, we have procedures to follow. Please let us do our job. Dr. Hayes's eyes narrowed. Your job doesn't include detaining a respected physician without cause. Do you even have evidence? Lane hesitated, glancing at Reed. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and some began recording on their phones. Before Lane could respond, the sound of another car pulling up drew everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV came to a halt, and a tall figure stepped out. James Walker, the city's police commissioner, surveyed the scene with a piercing gaze. What's the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. His eyes landed on Sophia, then shifted to the officers. Recognition flickered in his expression. Commissioner Walker, Lane stammered, suddenly at a loss for words. Walker's expression darkened. Release her. Now. The command was immediate, undeniable. Lane fumbled with the cuffs, while Reed stepped back, his bravado evaporating. The crowd watched in silence as Sophia's hands were freed, the cuffs clattering to the ground. Walker turned to Sophia, his voice softening. Are you all right, Dr. Grant? She nodded, though the humiliation lingered. Thank you, she said quietly. Walker's gaze shifted back to Lane and Reed, his tone icy. We'll discuss this back at the station. Expect consequences. As the officers lowered their heads, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Sophia stood tall, her resolve unshaken despite the ordeal. She knew this was just the beginning of a larger battle, one she couldn't afford to lose. Sophia's hands were still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel of her car, parked outside the hospital. The drive from the scene had been a blur. Her mind replayed every second of the confrontation with the officers, the flashing lights, the cold metallic clink of handcuffs, the piercing stares of passers-by. It felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't shake. Inside the hospital, the sterile hum of activity carried on as though nothing had happened. Doctors in scrubs hurried through the halls, patients were wheeled to and from operating rooms, and nurses exchanged updates in hushed tones. This was Sophia's sanctuary, the place where her decisions held life-altering weight, where her skills were revered. But tonight, it felt foreign. She checked the time. 15 minutes until the emergency surgery she had promised to perform. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached the entrance. The automated doors slid open, and the warmth of the hospital lobby wrapped around her. Still, the chill of what had just transpired clung to her. Dr. Grant, called a familiar voice. It was Ellie, one of the surgical assistants. The patient is prepped and waiting. Are you ready? Sophia managed a nod. Let's do this, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She couldn't afford to falter now. Someone's life depended on her. As she changed into her scrubs, the tension in her shoulders refused to ease. The sterile light of the operating room, the beeping monitors, and the quiet focus of her team offered a brief reprieve from the turmoil. For the next few hours, her world narrowed to the precision of her scalpel and the intricate dance of saving a life. When it was over, and the patient's vitals stabilized, Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The surgery had been a success. Yet as she peeled off her gloves and stepped away from the table, the relief was fleeting. The weight of earlier events came crashing back. She barely made it to the on-call room before collapsing onto the small cot. Closing her eyes, she tried to push the memory of the officers' sneering faces from her mind. But sleep didn't come. Instead, it was interrupted by the sharp buzz of her phone. The caller ID read, James Walker. Sophia hesitated before answering. Commissioner Walker, she said, her voice hoarse. Dr. Grant, I want to formally apologize for what happened earlier, he began. What those officers did was unacceptable, and I'm taking steps to address it. Sophia's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Commissioner, an apology doesn't erase what happened. If you hadn't shown up, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I understand your frustration, Walker said. That's why I'm conducting a full investigation. But I need your help. If you're willing, I'd like you to file a formal statement. Your account is crucial to ensuring justice is served. Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. The idea of reliving the incident was nauseating, but the alternative, allowing those officers to go unchallenged, was worse. I'll do it, she said finally. Thank you, Walker said, his tone earnest. And Dr. Grant. I'll make sure you're protected. This won't happen again. As the call ended, Sophia leaned back against the wall. The word protected echoed in her mind. How could anyone guarantee that? The image of the crowd's indifferent stares flashed before her, and she realized how alone she had felt in that moment. Even now, the sense of vulnerability lingered. The next day, the hospital's usual rhythm seemed oddly out of sync. News of Sophia's ordeal had spread, whispered among colleagues in the break room, and passed around in group chats. By the time she arrived for her shift, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Sophia, can we talk? Dr. Richard Hayes, her mentor and the chief of surgery, cornered her in the hallway. His expression was a mix of concern and frustration. I'm fine, she said preemptively. No, you're not, he countered. And neither is this hospital. Do you have any idea how much attention this incident is getting? The media's been calling non-stop. We need to get ahead of this. Sophia frowned. This isn't about the hospital's reputation. It's about what those officers did. I understand that, Hayes said, his tone softening. But we can't ignore the impact this could have. People are already questioning whether our staff is safe. I'm asking you to consider making a public statement. Something to reassure everyone. Sophia's gut reaction was to refuse. Why should she have to explain herself? But as she glanced around the bustling hallway, she saw the concern in her colleagues' faces. Maybe Hayes was right. Maybe her voice could make a difference. I'll think about it, she said, her tone clipped. Later that evening, Sophia sat in her apartment, staring at the blank document on her laptop. Writing a statement felt impossible. Every word she typed sounded either too defensive or too angry. Frustrated, she closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, she saw a woman standing there, her face unfamiliar but determined. Cautiously, Sophia opened the door. Dr. Grant? The woman asked. Yes, Sophia replied warily. My name is Lila Monroe, the woman said, extending a hand. I heard about what happened to you. And I think I can help. Sophia hesitated but eventually stepped aside to let her in. Help with what, exactly? Lila took a seat, her expression earnest. I work with a group that advocates for victims of police misconduct. We've been following your case closely, and we believe your story could bring about real change. Sophia folded her arms. I'm already cooperating with an investigation. What more do you want from me? Your voice, Lila said simply. People need to hear what happened. Not just the facts, but how it made you feel. The fear, the humiliation. Stories like yours have the power to shift public perception, to hold those in power accountable. Sophia's instinct was to push back, but something in Lila's tone struck a chord. She thought of the crowd that had watched her humiliation in silence. If speaking out could prevent someone else from enduring the same, wasn't it worth it? I'll consider it, Sophia said finally. Lila smiled. That's all I ask. As the days passed, Sophia found herself thrust into the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a respected doctor and a broken system. Online, the reactions were mixed. While many supported her, others accused her of playing the victim or using her status for attention. The noise was overwhelming, but amidst the chaos, Sophia began to see the broader implications of her ordeal. This wasn't just about her. It was about countless others who lacked the platform to fight back. Slowly, her resolve hardened. If the system wanted to silence her, she would make sure her voice was impossible to ignore. Sophia stood at the edge of the stage, her heart pounding in rhythm with the whispers of the crowd. The dimly lit community center auditorium was packed, every seat filled with faces brimming with curiosity, anger, and a thirst for change. This was her first public appearance since the incident, and it had been arranged by Lila Monroe's advocacy group. Though the support she received had been overwhelming, Sophia couldn't shake the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. The lights dimmed further, and the murmurs ceased. Lila stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding yet approachable. She gripped the microphone, scanning the audience before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we hear from someone whose courage has inspired us all. Please welcome Dr. Sophia Grant." A round of applause erupted, but Sophia barely registered it. Her legs felt like lead as she walked onto the stage. The spotlight blinded her momentarily, but as her eyes adjusted, she focused on the rows of faces staring back at her. Some were expectant, others skeptical, but all were waiting. She took a deep breath and began. "Good evening. I never imagined I would be standing here, speaking to all of you about something so personal, so painful. I am a surgeon. My job is to save lives, not to stand in the spotlight. But a few days ago, my life changed in a way I couldn't ignore." Sophia's voice wavered as she recounted the events of that night. She described the fear, the humiliation, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. For the first time, she felt the power of her story, not just as a recounting of events, but as a catalyst for something bigger. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about everyone who has been made to feel powerless. Everyone who has faced discrimination or abuse of authority and had no one to turn to. We deserve better. We must demand better." The applause was thunderous, and Sophia felt a spark of hope. She had feared this moment, but now she understood its importance. As she stepped off the stage, Lila met her with a reassuring smile. "You did it," she said. "This is just the beginning." Outside the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric. Activists, journalists, and community members crowded around Sophia, eager to speak with her. Among them was a tall, clean-cut man in a gray suit. He approached her with a polite smile, extending his hand. "Dr. Grant, I'm Ethan Caldwell, a civil rights attorney. Your story has deeply moved me, and I believe it could be the cornerstone of a significant legal case against systemic misconduct." Sophia hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of attention. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," she admitted. Ethan's expression softened. "I understand this is a lot to process. But if we can prove that what happened to you isn't an isolated incident, we could force real change. You don't have to decide now, but please think about it." Sophia nodded, taking his card. "Thank you. I will." As the crowd began to disperse, Sophia found a quiet corner to collect her thoughts. The evening had been overwhelming, but it also felt like a turning point. She knew that stepping into the public eye would bring challenges, but it also offered an opportunity to make a difference. And yet, doubt lingered. Could she handle the scrutiny? Would her voice truly matter? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Commissioner James Walker, urgent. "Need to meet. Call me ASAP." Sophia's stomach tightened. She stepped outside, the cool night air grounding her as she dialed his number. He picked up on the first ring. "Dr. Grant, thank you for calling," Walker said, his tone brisk. "We've uncovered something troubling during the investigation into Officers Lane and Reed." Sophia's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "It seems they've been involved in similar incidents before, but the reports were buried. This goes higher than we thought. I can't discuss details over the phone, but I need you to come to the station tomorrow. We'll go over everything in person." Sophia agreed, ending the call with a sense of unease. If this was bigger than just two rogue officers, what would it mean for her fight? For her safety? The next morning, she arrived at the station feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. Walker met her in his office, his usually composed demeanor strained. On his desk were several files, each one thick with documents. "Dr. Grant," he began, "your case has opened a floodgate. We've uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning years. Excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports, it's all here." Sophia's eyes widened as she flipped through the files. The stories mirrored her own, each one a testament to abuse of power. "Why hasn't this come to light before?" she asked. Walker's expression darkened. "Because people in power buried it. But now, with your story gaining traction, we have a chance to expose the truth. I need you to testify. Not just about your experience, but about what we've found here." Sophia's breath caught. Testifying would mean putting herself at even greater risk, but it would also mean taking a stand for those who couldn't. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Walker nodded. "Thank you. I'll make sure you have protection." As Sophia left the station, the weight of what she had agreed to settled over her. The path ahead was daunting, but she knew it was the right one. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. That night, as she worked late in the hospital, a shadow passed outside her office window. She dismissed it as her imagination, but a nagging sense of unease remained. When she left for the night, she noticed a black car parked down the street. It didn't move as she walked to her car, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was there for her. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Sophia met with Ethan Caldwell, who helped her craft her testimony. She also began receiving messages of support from people who had faced similar injustices. Each story strengthened her resolve, but the threats she received, anonymous emails, ominous letters, reminded her of the stakes. One evening, as she prepared to leave the hospital, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Dr. Grant," a distorted voice said. "You need to stop. Drop this case, or you'll regret it." Sophia's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" she demanded, but the line went dead. Shaking, she called Lila, who immediately arranged for additional security. "This means we're getting close," Lila said. "They're scared. And they should be." Despite the threats, Sophia refused to back down. On the day of her testimony, the courthouse was surrounded by media and protesters. As she walked up the steps, flanked by security, she felt the weight of countless eyes on her. But she also felt something else: strength. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Walker sat in the front row, his presence a silent assurance. Sophia took the stand, her voice clear and unwavering as she recounted her experience and the evidence she had seen. The room was silent, every word landing like a blow. When she finished, the cross-examination was brutal, but Sophia held her ground. By the end, it was clear that her testimony had made an impact. The case was far from over, but the tide was turning. As she left the courthouse, the crowd erupted in applause. Sophia felt tears sting her eyes, but she held her head high. This was more than a personal fight now. It was a movement. And she was ready to see it through to the end. Sophia stood by her kitchen window, staring at the darkened street outside. The lights from the lampposts cast long, wavering shadows on the pavement, but her focus was on the black sedan parked across the road. It had been there for 3 days now, its presence unsettlingly constant. She'd reported it to Commissioner Walker, who promised to investigate, but so far, nothing had changed. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. "It was Lila Monroe." "Sophia, how are you holding up?" Lila's voice carried its usual confidence, but tonight there was an edge of concern. "I'm fine," Sophia lied. "But that car, it hasn't moved." "I'll send someone to check on it," Lila said. "But we need to stay focused. The press conference tomorrow is crucial. Are you ready?" Sophia exhaled slowly. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be." The press conference had been organized by Lila's group, a strategic move to put more pressure on the city to act against the officers involved in Sophia's case. It was also an opportunity to spotlight the systemic issues that had allowed such abuses to persist. "Good," Lila said. "Remember, this isn't just about your story. It's about all the people who've suffered in silence. You're their voice now." The weight of those words settled heavily on Sophia's shoulders as she ended the call. She turned her attention back to the window, but the sedan was gone. Unease prickled at the back of her neck. The car had been there for days, and now suddenly, it wasn't. The following morning, the community center was buzzing with activity. Cameras were being set up, reporters jotted down notes, and members of the advocacy group moved briskly, organizing the space. Sophia arrived early, hoping to find a moment of calm before the chaos began. Instead, she was greeted by Ethan Caldwell, the civil rights attorney she'd met after her first speech. "Dr. Grant," Ethan said, extending a hand. "Good to see you again." "Ethan," Sophia replied, shaking his hand. "Thanks for being here." "I wouldn't miss it," he said. "The city's watching, and so are the people in power. This is our chance to make them listen." Before Sophia could respond, Lila approached, her clipboard in hand. "Sophia, we're ready for you. The press is already asking questions." Sophia nodded, steeling herself as she followed Lila to the stage. The room fell silent as she stepped up to the podium. Dozens of cameras focused on her, their lenses unblinking, waiting to capture every word. She began by recounting her experience, the fear and humiliation she'd felt that night. But as she spoke, her focus shifted to the broader issue. She highlighted the patterns of abuse uncovered during the investigation, the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. "This isn't just about me," Sophia said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's about every person who's been silenced, every injustice that's been ignored. We can't change the past, but we can demand a better future." The room erupted into applause. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping, but before Sophia could address them, a loud bang echoed from the back of the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a figure pushed through the doors, their face obscured by a hood. Security moved quickly, intercepting the intruder before they could get far. The room descended into chaos, with attendees scrambling for cover and reporters capturing the scene. Sophia's heart pounded as she was ushered off the stage and into a back room. "What just happened?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "We don't know yet," Lila said, her own composure shaken. "But you're safe. That's what matters." Minutes later, Commissioner Walker arrived, his expression grim. "Dr. Grant, we've identified the individual who disrupted the conference. They're connected to a group that's been targeting activists. This was a deliberate act of intimidation." Sophia's stomach churned. "So what happens now?" "We're increasing your security," Walker said. "And I'll be addressing the media to ensure they understand the seriousness of this threat." Despite his reassurances, Sophia felt a deep sense of unease. The stakes were higher than ever, and the opposition was growing bolder. That evening, as Sophia sat in her apartment, she replayed the events of the day in her mind. The hooded figure, the chaos, the sense of vulnerability. She'd expected resistance, but this was something else entirely. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated, peering through the peephole. It was Ethan. "What are you doing here?" Sophia asked as she opened the door. "I wanted to check on you," Ethan said, his concern evident. "Today was intense, and I know how overwhelming this can be." Sophia stepped aside, letting him in. "It's more than overwhelming. It's terrifying. I knew there would be pushback, but this feels personal." "That's because it is," Ethan said. "You're challenging a system that's been protected for years. They're scared, and they're lashing out. But that means we're making progress." "Progress," Sophia said, her voice tinged with frustration. "People could have been hurt today. I could have been hurt." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're right. And that's why we have to keep going. Because if we stop now, they win." Sophia nodded, though the fear lingered. She knew Ethan was right, but the path ahead felt more daunting than ever. In the days that followed, the attack at the press conference became a national story. News outlets dissected every detail, and public opinion grew increasingly polarized. Support for Sophia's cause surged, but so did the backlash. Threats continued to pour in, each one more disturbing than the last. Despite the heightened security, Sophia found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, the weight of the fight taking its toll. One evening, as she reviewed notes for an upcoming hearing, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You can't protect everyone. Walk away before it's too late." Sophia's hands shook as she read the message. She forwarded it to Walker, who assured her they were investigating, but the sense of impending danger was impossible to shake. Meanwhile, Lila's group worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. They organized rallies, gathered testimonies from other victims, and pushed for legislative action. Sophia attended every event, her resolve growing stronger with each story she heard. Yet, the fear remained, a constant undercurrent she couldn't escape. Late one night, as she prepared for bed, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911. From the safety of her locked bedroom, she could hear footsteps downstairs, the sound of drawers being opened and items being tossed. When the police arrived, the intruder was gone, but the damage was done. The living room was in shambles, and a message had been scrawled on the wall in red spray paint: "Stop or pay." Walker arrived shortly after, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "This has gone too far," he said. "We're moving you to a secure location until this is resolved." Sophia wanted to argue, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. She packed a bag and was escorted to a safe house, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She had chosen this fight, but at what cost? As she sat in the small, nondescript apartment that would be her home for the foreseeable future, Sophia felt a mix of fear and determination. The system she was fighting against was formidable, but so was she. And despite everything, she knew she couldn't stop now. The safe house where Sophia was relocated sat on the outskirts of Ravensborough, nestled among a cluster of trees that seemed to whisper secrets whenever the wind passed through. The single-story building was nondescript, with beige walls and narrow windows that barely let the sunlight in. Inside, it was furnished simply: a couch, a small table, and a bed. For Sophia, it felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. She stared out the window, her thoughts swirling like the autumn leaves outside. She had been in hiding for 3 days now, each one stretching longer than the last. Despite the efforts of Commissioner Walker and Lila's team to reassure her, the isolation gnawed at her resolve. The attack on her home had left a mark, not just on her belongings but on her spirit. The message scrawled in red spray paint, "Stop or pay," was burned into her memory. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. It was Ethan Caldwell. "Sophia," he began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We've made progress. I've been digging through old records, and there's a pattern emerging. These incidents go far deeper than we thought." "How deep?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough to implicate several high-ranking officials," Ethan said. "This isn't just about Lane and Reed anymore. There's a network protecting them, covering for their actions. If we can expose it, we could force systemic change." Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. "But that also means we're up against something much bigger." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "That's why we need to act carefully. Lila's organizing another rally, but I think we need to take this to the courts. If we file a civil rights lawsuit, we can bring this network to light." Sophia hesitated. The idea of a lawsuit was daunting. It would mean more public exposure, more scrutiny, and undoubtedly more threats. But it also offered the best chance to hold those responsible accountable. "I'll do it," she said finally. "Whatever it takes." That evening, Sophia's sense of unease grew. The isolation, combined with the weight of her decision, made the walls of the safe house feel like they were closing in. She decided to take a walk around the property, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. The forest was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. But as Sophia walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stopped, glancing over her shoulder. The path behind her was empty, but the shadows between the trees seemed to shift. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, though her pulse quickened. She turned back toward the safe house, quickening her pace. The crunch of leaves underfoot seemed louder now, each step echoing in the stillness. When she reached the porch, she stopped again, listening. The forest was silent. Too silent. Sophia stepped inside and locked the door, her heart pounding. She checked the windows, ensuring each one was secured. As she moved through the house, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever." Sophia's blood ran cold. She immediately forwarded the message to Walker, who called her within minutes. "We're tracing the number," he said, his tone firm. "But I'm sending someone to stay with you. You shouldn't be alone." An hour later, a car pulled up outside the safe house. Sophia peered through the curtains, her breath catching when she saw who stepped out. It was a woman, tall and athletic, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore a leather jacket and carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Dr. Grant," the woman said when Sophia opened the door. "I'm Detective Riley Carter. Commissioner Walker assigned me to your detail." Sophia nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure what to expect." "That's understandable," Riley said, her voice calm but authoritative. "My job is to make sure you stay safe. Has anything unusual happened tonight?" Sophia hesitated, then recounted her walk in the woods and the text message. Riley listened intently, her expression unreadable. "You did the right thing by calling it in," Riley said. "I'll be staying here tonight. If anything happens, you call me." "Understood." Sophia nodded. For the first time in days, she felt a small measure of relief. Riley's presence was reassuring, her confidence infectious. That night, Sophia slept fitfully, her dreams plagued by shadowy figures and echoing threats. She woke to the sound of voices outside. For a moment, she froze, her mind racing. Then she remembered Riley and hurried to the window. Riley stood on the porch, speaking with a man Sophia didn't recognize. He was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. As Sophia watched, Riley's posture tensed, and she placed a hand on the firearm holstered at her hip. Sophia opened the door a crack, straining to hear their conversation. "I'm telling you, I'm just passing through," the man said, raising his hands. "Didn't mean to spook anyone." "Then you won't mind answering a few questions," Riley replied, her tone cold. The man hesitated, then nodded. Riley led him to the edge of the porch, keeping her hand on her firearm. After a tense few minutes, the man walked away, disappearing into the woods. Riley returned to the house, her expression grim. "Who was that?" Sophia asked. "Probably nothing," Riley said. "But I'm not taking any chances. Keep your phone close. I'll be watching the perimeter." The rest of the night passed without incident, but Sophia's nerves were frayed. By morning, she was more determined than ever to see this fight through. The threats, the intimidation, it all pointed to one thing: she was making progress. And if they were trying this hard to silence her, it meant her voice mattered. Over the next few days, Sophia and Riley settled into an uneasy routine. Riley's presence was a constant reminder of the danger, but it also gave Sophia a sense of security. Together, they prepared for the lawsuit, working with Ethan and Lila to gather evidence and build their case. As the hearing date approached, tensions escalated. The opposition, those implicated in the network of misconduct, began to push back more aggressively. Sophia's supporters rallied around her, but the threats continued to loom large. On the eve of the hearing, Sophia received another message. This one was different. Instead of a threat, it contained a single sentence: "You're closer than you think." Sophia showed the message to Riley, who immediately contacted Walker. "This could be a lead," Riley said. "We need to follow up." As Sophia prepared for the biggest fight of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The safe house, the threats, the shadows in the woods, it all felt like the calm before the storm. But no matter what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Sophia entered, flanked by Detective Riley Carter and Ethan Caldwell. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only accompanies a battle where the stakes could not be higher. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, cameras flashed intermittently, and a few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and the back wall was lined with observers hoping to witness the unfolding drama. Sophia's heart thudded in her chest as she took her place at the plaintiff's table. Today wasn't just about her case, it was about exposing the corruption that had allowed abuses to persist for years. The civil rights lawsuit she'd filed, supported by a coalition of victims and activists, was the first step in a fight to dismantle the insidious network she and Ethan had uncovered. Across the room sat Lane and Reed, the officers whose actions had set everything in motion. Their expressions were stoic, but there was a flicker of unease in their eyes. They weren't just defending themselves, they were defending an entire system. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. A gavel struck, sharp and commanding. Court is now in session. The case of Grant versus the Ravensboro Police Department will commence. Ethan stood to deliver his opening statement. He spoke with calm conviction, painting a picture of systemic abuse, cover-ups, and the chilling pattern of intimidation faced by anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. His words resonated deeply, and Sophia could see nods of agreement among the spectators. When the defense attorney rose, the tone shifted. He portrayed Lane and Reed as dedicated officers who had simply followed procedure. He dismissed Sophia's claims as exaggerations and suggested that the lawsuit was a publicity stunt orchestrated by opportunists. Sophia's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She had expected this. The truth would come out in time. The first day of the trial was grueling. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting stories that mirrored Sophia's own. A young black man described being detained and humiliated without cause. A Latina woman shared how she was falsely accused of theft and subjected to invasive searches. Their voices cracked under the weight of their experiences, but their determination shone through. Each testimony chipped away at the defense's narrative, revealing the systemic rot beneath the surface. By the end of the day, The gallery was alive with whispered conversations, a collective acknowledgement that something monumental was happening. That evening, Sophia returned to the safe house, exhausted but hopeful. Riley was already there, scanning security footage on her laptop. "How'd it go?" Riley asked without looking up. "It was powerful," Sophia replied, sinking into a chair. "But we're just getting started." Riley nodded. "Stay focused. They'll fight back harder now." Sophia's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Lila Monroe. "Incredible first day. The media is on fire. Stay strong." She allowed herself a small smile before turning her attention to the pile of documents Ethan had left for her. Tomorrow, it would be her turn to testify. The next morning, Sophia took the stand. As she raised her hand to swear the oath, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her an encouraging nod, then at Riley, who stood at the back of the courtroom, a silent sentinel. Ethan began with gentle questions, guiding Sophia through her story. She recounted the night she was detained, the fear and humiliation she'd felt, and the aftermath that had appended her life. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the raw pain of her experience. When the defense attorney stood for cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. His questions were sharp, designed to undermine her credibility and cast doubt on her motives. "Dr. Grant, isn't it true that you've received significant media attention since this incident?" he asked. "Yes," Sophia replied. "But I didn't seek it out. The attention came because people recognized the injustice of what happened." "And isn't it true that you've partnered with advocacy groups who have their own agendas?" Sophia met his gaze, unflinching. "Their agenda is justice. I don't see a problem with that." The attorney smirked but moved on. He tried to rattle her with insinuations and pointed questions, but Sophia's resolve held firm. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with admiration for her poise. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day bringing new revelations. Internal documents from the Ravensborough Police Department, leaked by a whistleblower, exposed a culture of complicity and silence. Emails revealed how complaints were buried, and how officers like Lane and Reed were protected. One night, as Sophia and Riley reviewed the latest evidence, there was a knock at the door. Riley motioned for Sophia to stay back as she opened it, her hand on her holstered weapon. A courier handed her an envelope and left without a word. Inside was a letter, typed and unsigned. It read, "Drop the case. You don't know who you're dealing with." Sophia's hands trembled as she read it. Riley scanned the room, her expression grim. "We need to report this immediately." The threats escalated in the days that followed, but so did the support. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs that read "Justice for all and no more silence." Sophia's case had become a rallying cry for change, and she drew strength from the people who stood with her. As the trial neared its conclusion, Ethan delivered a closing argument that left the courtroom spellbound. He spoke not just of Sophia's courage, but of the systemic failures that had allowed such abuses to flourish. "This case isn't just about one night or two officers," he said. "It's about a system that prioritizes power over accountability, silence over justice. Today, we have the chance to change that." The defense's closing argument was predictably dismissive, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. When the judge announced that a verdict would be reached the following week, the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Sophia left the courthouse that day feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. The fight wasn't over, but the end was in sight. As she walked to the car, flanked by Riley and Ethan, she glanced at the crowd. Among the faces, she saw a young girl holding a sign that read, "Thank you, Dr. Grant." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that justice was possible. The courtroom was hushed, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation as the jury filed back into the room. The judge's gavel had signaled their return, and every eye in the gallery was trained on the foreperson. Sophia sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, his expression a mix of hope and determination. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper. "We have, Your Honor." The silence was deafening as the verdict was read. The gallery held its collective breath, and when the words "guilty" echoed through the room, a wave of relief and triumph rippled through Sophia's supporters. The judge's voice cut through the noise, reminding everyone that the courtroom was not a place for celebration, But the message was clear: justice had been served. As the judge adjourned the session, Sophia's emotions surged. Tears welled in her eyes as she exchanged a glance with Ethan. The battle had been long and grueling, but they had achieved what many thought impossible. Lane and Reed, along with other complicit individuals, were held accountable, and the systemic corruption within the Ravensborough Police Department was laid bare. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. Protesters and supporters gathered, their cheers echoing through the city. Sophia stepped onto the courthouse steps, the flash of cameras momentarily blinding her. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but she raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "This victory is not just mine," Sophia began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "It belongs to every person who has been silenced, every victim of abuse who never had their day in court. Today, we proved that change is possible. But our work is far from over." The crowd erupted once more, their chants of justice for all, filling the air. Lila Monroe stood nearby, her expression one of pride and determination. She stepped forward to embrace Sophia, whispering, "You did it. We all did." As the crowd began to disperse, Sophia's sense of accomplishment was tempered by a lingering unease. The threats she had received over the past weeks had grown more pointed, and though she had won this battle, she knew the war was far from over. That evening, Sophia returned to the safe house, now feeling more like a temporary reprieve than a refuge. Riley Carter was waiting for her, her posture as vigilant as ever. "Congratulations," Riley said, offering a rare smile. "You changed history today." "We all did," Sophia replied. But her smile faded as she glanced at the stack of papers on the table, evidence from Ethan that pointed to more widespread corruption, reaching far beyond Ravensborough. "Riley," Sophia began, hesitating. "Do you ever feel like this is just the beginning?" Riley's expression darkened slightly. "It's not a feeling," she said. "It's a fact. You've shaken a very dangerous tree, and there are still people out there who don't want you digging deeper." Sophia nodded, the weight of Riley's words settling over her. She thought back to the letter she had received, the cryptic warnings and veiled threats. Her victory today had only made her more of a target. The next morning, Sophia woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. The caller ID showed Ethan's name. "Sophia, turn on the news," he said, his voice tense. She grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news channel. The headline scrolling across the screen made her blood run cold. "Ravensborough police scandal expands. Key witness found dead." Sophia's heart pounded as the anchor recounted the story. The witness, a former officer who had agreed to testify against higher-ups in the department, had been found in his home, the circumstances of his death suspicious. Riley appeared in the doorway, having overheard the broadcast. "This isn't a coincidence," she said grimly. "They're sending a message." Sophia felt a surge of anger and fear. She had known the risks, but this was a stark reminder of the forces she was up against. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Riley stepped closer. "We keep moving forward. We don't let them intimidate us. But you need to be more careful than ever." Over the next few days, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Ethan uncovered more evidence linking the Ravensborough network to other cities, suggesting a far-reaching web of corruption. Meanwhile, Sophia's supporters rallied around her, their resolve bolstered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. One evening, as Sophia reviewed the latest findings, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but this is just the beginning. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Sophia showed the message to Riley, who immediately forwarded it to Commissioner Walker. "This isn't going to stop," Riley said. "You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Despite the threats, Sophia's determination only grew. She agreed to an interview with a national news outlet, using the platform to highlight the systemic issues she had uncovered. The interview garnered widespread attention, drawing both praise and further backlash. As the weeks passed, Sophia began to notice strange occurrences. A car that seemed to follow her for miles, unfamiliar faces lingering near the safe house. Riley's vigilance increased, but the sense of unease was inescapable. One night, as Sophia prepared to leave for a meeting with Lila and Ethan, Riley stopped her. "Wait," she said, her voice low. "I've got a bad feeling about this. Let me check the car." Sophia watched from the doorway as Riley inspected the vehicle. Moments later, Riley's head snapped up, her expression alarmed. "Get back inside," she barked. Sophia obeyed, her pulse racing. Minutes later, a bomb squad arrived, confirming what Riley had suspected. An explosive device had been planted under the car. The discovery sent shockwaves through Sophia's team. Lila and Ethan urged her to go public with the threat, but Sophia hesitated. She didn't want to appear weak or fearful, even as the danger escalated. Instead, she focused on the next phase of her fight. Ethan filed additional lawsuits, targeting officials implicated in the newly uncovered evidence. Lila organized more rallies, drawing national attention to their cause. Through it all, Sophia remained at the center, her resolve unwavering. But the threats didn't stop. One evening, Sophia returned to the safe house to find a single envelope waiting on the kitchen table. Inside was a photo of her family, taken from a distance, accompanied by a note, "They're not safe either." Sophia's hands shook as she showed the photo to Riley. "This is too far," she said, her voice breaking. Riley's expression hardened. "We'll protect them. But Sophia, you need to think carefully about your next move. These people, they won't stop." Sophia sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had come so far, but at what cost? The faces of the people she had fought for flashed through her mind, their stories fueling her resolve. The next morning, she called a press conference. Standing before the cameras, she addressed the threats head-on. "To those who seek to silence me," Sophia said, her voice steady, "know this, I will not back down. You may threaten me, you may try to intimidate my family, but I will not stop fighting for justice. This is bigger than me, and I will see it through." The crowd erupted into applause, their support a tangible force. But as Sophia stepped away from the podium, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Later that night, as she sat alone in the safe house, a shadow passed outside the window. Riley was patrolling the perimeter, but Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The phone on the table buzzed with a new message. "The end is closer than you think." Sophia stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. The war wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The battle for justice had only just begun.